everyone, we are about to start our week 9 demo on textures. I'm going to show you a bunch of different processes today that will help you create multiple layers in your work and give you the ability to create an intelligent surface that you can work back into. So the first thing I want to talk about today are acrylic skins. And when I say acrylic skins, that's just my own term. But what I'm talking about are skins that are created with acrylic mediums and acrylic paints, like our normal Liquitex Basics acrylic paint that you'd see in the studio, like house paint. So any samples that you might have around the house, in the basement, in the garage are viable options. And also acrylic medium. You can also use cornstarch or a flour mixture to do this process, and I'll show you that a little bit later. Okay? So what we're talking about here are these skins that you can create by layering your acrylic medium over the surface of some sort of plastic. So here I've used plastic wrap. Everybody should have that around in the kitchen. You can also use grocery bags, any sort of plastic containers that you have around. This was the cut off bottom of a lettuce container. It's got some nice little pock marks in it, so I'll show you how to cast with that in just a minute. But basically, the process is pretty simple. You're just going to take your plastic wrap, and you're going to paint on that wrap whatever you so choose. So let me start with some acrylic medium. You can use modeling paste, matte varnish, or gloss medium. Gloss medium is what I used here. You can see how shiny it is and very, very transparent. So let's use a little bit of each just so you can see how it works. So I'm going to take my brush here, and you don't have to apply with a brush. You can apply with a palette knife, you can apply with your finger, you can apply with whatever you like. Let's find the side of my plastic wrap here. And I'm going to create sort of a feathered, lacy brush strokey look here. If I'm lucky, I'll be able to peel this off and retain some of the brush strokes. But what will help me do that is if I start on one side and make that side still aesthetically pleasing and to my liking, but if I make that side a little bit thicker, and when it dries, that's where I'm going to start, and I know that I will be able to get that off a lot easier to start my peeling process as opposed to some of these thinner areas. So I can leave that like that. Let me show you some of the modeling paste. Use a palette knife for this. This is going to be thicker, and it's not going to be as transparent when it dries. You can see how thick it is. But this is still an acrylic medium, so it's going to be flexible for me, even when it's dry, and allow me to create just a little bit more height in my textural elements here. I could also tint this, or I could mix right on my palette here. So I am just playing around right now. Because these are both acrylic mediums, they are completely compatible. So there are some examples of what you can do on a flat surface with these acrylic skins. Now let me show you a little bit how to cast with them. So if I wanted to cast with my acrylic paints or my cornstarch medium or my house paint, what I would want to do is I would want to make sure that my acrylic medium is not going to stick to my plastic mold. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little bit of petroleum jelly. You can also use olive oil, vegetable oil, and just take a little bit on a paper towel and rub it across the surface. Because I've got a little bit more texture in here, I want to make sure I get my petroleum jelly down in to all of the holes. You'll end up with a little bit of a film on the back of your acrylic skin, but you can just wipe it away when it's done. And you don't need very much. You only need enough to create a barrier between the water-based paint and the plastic that you're casting into. So you saw me wipe away quite a bit of the petroleum jelly, and you'll want to do the same thing with the oil if you use cooking oil or something like that. Okay? So same process as with working flat, we're just working on an articulated surface here. And then I'll just use my paintbrush to move the pigment around the surface. So if you think back to the beginning of the semester, you might remember this term tiling grid as a system for creating some different compositional considerations. So how I did this is I used some graph paper and I created 1-inch squares, 4x4 on my graph paper. You can also do this if you don't have graph paper using some notebook paper. All you're going to do is take your ruler, measure out the distance between your lines, and then you'll create that perfectly symmetric grid all the way down. So once I have my basic grid here, what I'll do is I'll take some tracing paper or vellum. You can use either one of these types of papers, or as I did here, if you don't have those available to you, you can use parchment paper like you'd use to bake cookies on, or wax paper. Tissue paper also works really well. It doesn't matter what color it is, as long as you can see through it enough to see your grid lines. So if you have some darker colored tissue paper, maybe just use a Sharpie so you can see your lines a little bit darker. Okay, so what I did here was I created a grid pattern. I've got my corners marked with little hatch marks so it lines up, and I created a really loose grid pattern here, geometric stair-step pattern. Okay, so what do I do with this is the question, right? So I could keep working and I could keep going and adding a little bit more sophistication to this grid, or I could take this just a piece of paper under here so I can see what's going on. And I could then lay my plastic wrap over the top so I could see what's underneath and start to delineate some of these shapes and forms. So you get the idea there, following the guidelines of the pattern that I created for myself using my tiling grid. The other thing I want to show you is another way to use a tiling grid. This is a more organic grid. And I made some rules for myself. I decided that the only lines I could make would curve from corner to corner diagonally, and they would have an arc, and they would always go positive, negative, back and forth, like a wave pattern. I also decided that I would never start two lines in the same box. Sometimes I ended up in the same box, but I decided I'd make my way around and I would know when I was finished if every box was filled. So if you feel a little bit lost when you're doing your tiling grids and you don't know where to start, make some rules for yourself and follow through with those rules. Play around and see what looks good, what's aesthetically pleasing to you, and go from there. So I'm going to cut into this pattern here, and then I'm going to scrape some cornstarch over the surface to create a pattern on a collage ground. So you can see the both So you can see the positive and the negative of the stencil here. One, I used my cornstarch with a palette knife and a trowel and scraped the cornstarch over top of the stencil. The other, I flipped over my already used stencil and created almost a print of my cornstarch medium on my ground. These pieces can then be worked back into applying paint over the top, scraped back into, and gluing, cutting pieces of paper over the surface of your ground to create a multiple layer effect. The next thing I want to talk about really quickly is at-home encaustic, which basically just means the using of wax medium to hold our collage elements together. So I've gathered some of the old candles that I have found around the house, and I'm assuming that none of you have encaustic supplies in your studio at home, but many of you might have old candles that you thought you were going to use but haven't burned yet, or old candles around from camping that you can use to suspend different types of collage elements in. To pigment these candles, if they're white or clear, we can use a couple different options here. We can use oil pastels. They're oil compatible medium. You can use oil pastels if you have those around, or you can also use Crayola crayons. Any Crayola crayon is just going to melt right into your wax and give it a little bit of a tint of color. So this is not traditional encaustic painting, but because we're at home and we don't have some of the materials that we were planning to have, this is the next best thing. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how to float a piece of paper, creating a shadow box effect, and encapsulate different images and fibers in the wax. Okay? So the most important thing to remember is that wax is really, really messy. So when you're working with wax, you want to make sure that you have a very well set up and laid out studio space. If you're working in your kitchen or something like that, make sure you cover everything with newspaper or paper towel. Okay, so I've got a pancake griddle over to my left here that's starting to warm up here. You can use any sort of metal tin to melt your wax in. What you'll do is you'll cut up your candle nice and small. You can also break it up. There's going to be the wick in the center, right, that you can just pull out after it's melted. You'll put it in your tin and then pop your tin onto your pancake griddle. So these are fancier encaustic candle making tins. You can also use tin cans from your pantry. Just make sure there's no paper on them and nothing on the bottom. Okay, so I'll set up and get a couple tins going here of my homemade encaustic material, and then I'll show you how we can make our colors. So I've got my wax set up on my pancake griddle, and I'm just waiting for it to melt down so I can add some of my oil pastels and get some color into my wax. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to prepare my ground. When you're working with wax, you need to work very quickly because as the wax cools, it becomes unworkable. So we need to work with the wax while it's hot. One thing that you can do to help is if you have a heat gun at home, it's a wonderfully handy tool. Otherwise, you can also use a hair dryer. Just turn it up all the way, make sure it's back off the surface of your paper, back off the surface of the wax so that the wax doesn't ignite. It'll take a little bit longer than a normal heat gun, but it should work okay for our purposes here. Remember, this is not a professional encaustic process. This is just for experimentation, and if you like working with wax later on, what you can do is you can get into some higher tech encaustic work and get into the archival mode. up. It's starting to melt here, and I've got the basic layout of my collage laid out on my table. And you might hear that I turned on a fan in my studio window. One thing I do want to mention about working with wax, if you're working at home and you're working inside, is that you need a really well ventilated area. The wax does heat up and start to smell, and if you're working for a long period of time, it can be a little bit hazardous to your respiratory tract. So you want to make sure that you're prepping and setting yourself up for success as far as ventilation. So I'm just going to put a drop sheet down here to make sure that I stay nice and clean on my cutting mat. I've got my compositional elements all cut out here for my collage and ready to go. So one thing to note about working with wax is between every layer of wax you need to fuse. Fusing means you're going to heat up with your heat gun or your hair dryer and make sure that the previous layer of wax holds on to the layer of wax that you just laid down. Okay? So I'm going to lay down a thin layer of my clear wax from my camping candles as a bed for my imagery. And I'm working on a porous surface here. Really important that you work on something porous and not overly bendable. Wax tends to like to crack when it gets colder, when it cools. So make sure that if you are using this technique and you're planning on layering a whole bunch of different layers, getting pretty thick with your wax, that you work on something like a mat board or even a piece of wood would be best. So where the wax is its hottest, it's soaking into my ground a little bit better. And then I'll just take my heat gun, and just like I said, I'm going to fuse that wax to my ground. So I want to keep the heat gun a little bit off the surface so that I don't get too hot and burn my wax. And I like to work in a circular motion with my heat gun because it keeps the wax moving around and it helps me sort of buff out any rough brush strokes that I had. And once this is nice and warm and fused, I will grab my background color, this piece of paper here, and do the same thing on its opposite side because I want the two layers of wax to fuse together. So I'm using the wax as my adhesive here. And do be careful after you heat your wax up, it's obviously going to be hot. So when you put your hands down, if you're very sensitive to heat, you might want to just put a towel or something over the top. Make sure it's an old one because it will get wax on it. But the wax does get very hot, so please be careful as you work. So I've got a couple areas here where I might go over with my brush again, just to make sure that the wax is nice and thick and my paper is completely impregnated, completely sodden and infused with that wax. So another thing I want to show you with wax is this wonderful ability to create a floating or shadow box effect with different collage elements. I've talked about this with some of you before, but the nice thing about wax is when your paper is completely infused in multiple layers of wax, it gives it this wonderful body that allows it to stand up on its own and retain some sort of objecthood within your composition. So I'm going to use these tacks. They're just upholstery tacks, and they seem to go with the color palette and the feel of my collage. What I'm going to do is just going to poke these through the corners one at the end. So it'll give me a nice shadow coming across my composition here. So normally if I was just using a piece of paper, you can kind of see how it dips in the middle here. But when I paint this with wax, let it dry, and then apply it to the surface, it's going to stand up nice and taut for me. So there you have a few of the things that you can do with your wax. I added a couple objects up here and suspended those in a thicker layer of wax, making sure to fuse before and after I had applied these little buttons. So they're pretty much sandwiched in between my wax here, okay? And then I added a texture element with some yarn and just kind of spot tacked it down in these different areas to help hold it and allowed it to be loose in the other areas. So there's one more thing I want to show you with wax. It's a technique called sgraffito. And what this is basically a form of texture and imagery made by scratching through a surface to reveal a lower layer of contrasting color. So typically this is done, traditionally it's done in plaster or stucco on walls with slip on ceramics before firing, but you can also do this with wax. So you can scratch back into any surface of wax as long as it's pretty cooled. Not all the way cooled, but pretty cooled so that it has just a little bit of a tack for you and it remains soft. So I'm going to be applying a couple layers of wax to this colored ground. You can also apply an image first and then carve back into it to reveal some of the imagery behind it, some of the definition, maybe a figurative element behind it. And I'm going to be applying a couple layers of wax here in different colors and then scratching back into them so that you can see how this works. So there you have it. We're finished with our processes for this demonstration. Make sure you check the images below for finished and dried versions of the acrylic skins and some other examples of each of the different processes.